What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hapnas, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I am on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Robert Poynton, and we speak about improvisation and facilitation, and how to facilitate pause and the beauty of silence and everything in between. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now be prepared to be inspired. Hello, Robert. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, I'm looking forward. I was devouring your book, Do Pause, during my summer holidays. And after I finished the book, I was impatiently waiting to the end of my summer holidays so that I could open LinkedIn and invite you to join me on the podcast.
Well, that's fittingly ironic. I've had the opposite, people saying that they took forever to read Do Pause, which I think is also enjoyable. So yeah, each to his own. But I'm glad you found it and I'm glad to be here.
Yes. And you also published another book, is Do Improvise. So today we're going to speak about facilitation and hopefully cover the pause part and the improvisation part and anything that is in between. And let's start at the beginning. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I think I do, yeah. I think I talk about myself as a convener of spaces and a facilitator. And I suppose the fashionable thing to call it these days is experience design. And that's a label I'm not particularly comfortable with. And I don't know, if I cast my mind back, I think I probably started calling myself a facilitator, or perhaps thinking of myself at least as a facilitator, probably 30 years ago. I'd worked in advertising as my first career, and in that context, I'd moderated focus groups, and that's the word we would use. We were moderators. And so in that context, you are negotiating, if you like, between a client with an agenda and a certain number of questions that need to be asked, and consumers or the general public in the form of a small group. But that I saw as a specific skill for a specific end. And I think it was a few years after that when I'd started working in a more sort of consultancy capacity, where I realized that much of what I was doing wasn't so much providing what these days we would call content or answers or strategies, but was actually facilitating the different people involved in the process. And there was one particular occasion where I was working for a drinks company in some quite stressful circumstances. And there were essentially two groups of people involved in this 3-day meeting. And half of them were from the head office of this company and half of them were from the regions or the markets. And as it happened, they sat on opposite sides of the table. And it was as if it was like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It felt like as the day went on, the first day, the table just got wider and wider and wider as these people got further and further and further. And this caused me a sleepless night on that occasion. And I won't go through the whole story, but essentially 3 days later, where I had a number of realizations about what was possible for me in my position as a facilitator that the participants couldn't themselves see, and helping the whole group to find a way to reconnect and understand each other. And I'll never forget being in the bar afterwards in this hotel we were working in, and the most senior client, who was British and had this sort of very typically British way of saying things. And he turned to me and said, yes, he said, yes, one day you might not be entirely bad at this. And that was, to me, that was a seminal experience. And that's where I realized not only was I doing this job, that I had some facility with facilitation, if you like, that there was something I was doing perhaps quite instinctively or naturally that seemed at that level to be working. Yeah, that was 1994. I think that was.
Wow. And I cannot not ask the question, what is it about experience design that you cannot connect to?
Well, I think the first few times I heard it, I didn't know what it meant. So I heard people bandy it around as if it was self-evident what it meant. And so I think that kind of steers part of my reaction, because I feel it's a phrase that if you understand what it means, then it's meaningful. But to somebody who's not heard it before, it's not particularly explanatory. So I don't think it's particularly useful. And I think in a way it can be a little bit of dressing something up as quite grand, which is actually quite simple, not necessarily easy. Easy and simple are two different things, but quite simple and quite ordinary and quite everyday. At the same time, I do have, I'm not that upset with it as a term, because actually when I think carefully about what I do spend an enormous amount of time and energy thinking carefully about how to design not a product or an object, but yes, an experience, an event, something that people come to. So it is accurate. I just think it hasn't quite got the right tone for me.
Yeah. And I wonder whether it goes in the direction of almost entertainment. And when I think of your example with this leadership team, could you really summarize the work you were doing as experience design? Because yes, maybe it's also about the experience, but it's much more than that. It's really getting them closer together, shrinking the table.
Absolutely. In that case, it was a very thorny, very deep, it was the legacy of a structural issue within a company, as I'm sure many people can imagine with what I've said. And there was nothing about it that was necessarily to do with entertainment. It was to do with problem solving. It was to do with creating connection. It was about resolving misunderstandings and conflicts. I suppose the entertainment piece would come in that some of the ways we did that on that particular occasion involved drawing, and some of them involved exercises involving movement and being outside in the gardens. But those things weren't for the purpose of entertainment. They were necessary steps in order to get to the real core issue that was going on, which is about misunderstanding and conflict.
And when I hear movement and drawing and getting out in the garden, I obviously maybe think of the improvisation work that you're doing, which is embodied. Did you bring this together from the beginning? Or how did you connect these to the facilitation and the improvisation at some point?
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of context necessary here. So what has always interested me is the kind of messy everyday world we live in, not the sort of sanitized, clean version that's on the organogram in the organization, if it's a business context, or in the laboratory, if it's a kind of scientific approach to something. So the sort of messy everyday world is what had always interested me. And so when I came across improvisation, which happened by chance, I met somebody who was a professional improviser on the stage. I realized that they have a way of dealing with the kind of unpredictable mess of everyday life that we have to deal with in organizations and in business, and also that science deals with in a body of science I've got very interested in called complexity science, which I've been drawn to for the same reason, because it deals with the kind of everyday nature of messy reality, not that clean laboratory version. But the trouble was that I'd sort of tried the science as a tool for facilitation, actually, and that had gone horribly wrong when there was one workshop I was running where somebody said, "Why does this sound like a new religion?" Which wasn't what I'd been hoping for, I have to say. And we can explore that question if it's of interest. But so I'd sort of struggled with this. And then when I came across this professional improviser, and we just fell into a kind of very ordinary kind of getting to know each other kind of conversation. And I could see from the things he was saying immediately that this was a very simple, playful, ordinary way, that there was a kind of method underlying what people in the theatre do that you could take and use elsewhere. And in that very first meeting with this guy, who's now one of my best friends, a guy called Gary Hirsch, I asked him a question. I said, could you use that to facilitate a group of top executives from an advertising agency? And he went, "Oh, yeah, sure," as if he did it every day. Because I later on learned he was going kind of, like that inside. But the discipline of improv itself would say to you, you say yes to things, And so we very quickly began working together, and it turned out to have all the features and benefits I'd been looking for as tools to use with groups of people that I'd been sort of hoping that the scientific approach would bring, but which I wasn't able to kind of make work. So, yeah, it was a very sweet coming together of a number of strands through this piece of happenstance, really.
Beautiful. And I would love to come back to the new religion piece. And let's dive right away into it, if you don't mind. Yeah.
No, of course not. No. So my path into this was, it's quite funny. I realized this just the other day, that I first was struck by a presentation about catastrophe theory. That was the first thing that, and this was in the ad agency in which I worked. Somebody came in talking about catastrophic events like avalanches and things, and whether you can predict them or not, and how you can predict them. And then I thought that was all fascinating because, again, an avalanche, like a real thing. And then after that, I got interested in chaos theory. Mm-hmm. And then after that, that led to complexity theory. And all of these sort of scientific bodies of work are ways, like I say, of understanding the complex nature of everyday reality. And so I got kind of very curious about this for various reasons to do with my own education and some of its shortcomings. And I spent a month at a place in England called Schumacher College with a scientist called Fritjof Capra, who originally worked in quantum mechanics, but had subsequently kind of done a lot of work about complex adaptive systems in a biological context. And so I'd sort of been steeped in this very different way of seeing the world. And I was starting to kind of, if you think of it as like learning a language, I was starting to be able to speak this language and understand it. And like all of these subworlds, there are reference points and names. So Ilya Prigogine, Fritjof Capra, quantum mechanics, emergent points, dissipative structures, attractor basins. There's a lot of language that comes with it. And all of these things mean particular things in this mind. But of course, I'd forgotten at the point I was trying to use it in a workshop that I'd traveled very far and the people I was with hadn't started that journey at all. And so when you start referring to or quoting or using the language both of people or of concepts, that you're speaking them as if they were self-evident, and yet they're completely opaque to the people involved, then it sounds both mysterious, i.e. incomprehensible, but also slightly mystical. It's like, oh, there's some woo-woo going on here.
Very exclusive.
Very exclusive. I never heard of any of these people or any of these things. So I think that's what was behind it, this idea that, oh, there's a closed world over here with its own private language that I can't speak. And so if you're leading something where you're helping to, or hoping to invite people to discover and learn and create, then that's not very helpful. It was a very uncomfortable comment in the moment and a very helpful comment over time, because it helped me to see what some of the limitations of that way of working were versus the improvisational way of approaching many very similar ideas is playful, participative. It's very light. It runs another risk, which is of being seen as sort of trivial and inconsequential. But there are things you can do to kind of offset that as well.
There are several thoughts that come to my mind. One is, it almost seems as if in the scientific approach you described previously, it's first you have to set the ground and explain all the things to then make sense out of it. Whereas in the with the improv approach, you first experience it, you play it, you do it, and then you have to do the hard work to make sense and to debrief so that it lands.
That's beautifully put. And I think to build on that, there's a disadvantage to the scientific approach, because the scientific one necessarily requires a lot of the explanation to happen with a particular kind of intelligence. So it's conceptual, it's abstract. It often requires a prior understanding of lots of other ideas and bodies of knowledge. It doesn't engage our multiple intelligences. And at that point, it's quite hard to see how it's connected to what I'm doing or interested in as a participant. Whereas with the improvisational way of working, there are, as I say, other traps. You have to be careful not to be seen as trivial. There's something Gary and I identified very early, which is something we call the fun barrier, which we can explore a bit more if you like. But essentially, you're inviting people to participate more fully. As you rightly said earlier, the improvisational way of working, at least as it comes out of the theatre, is embodied. So you're using movement, you're using position, posture, you're using a much wider range of things. And even if they're slightly skeptical, at heart, everybody, the vast majority of people, enjoy playing. And so as long as you can find a way to make sense of that playing for them, which is, as you absolutely rightly pointed out, you can do afterwards, and you can do it quite quickly. And you can do as much of an explanation as you need to get them to want to participate very quickly at the beginning. You know, you can do that in a few seconds almost. So that way you've had them, in a way you sort of caught them succeeding, because the other big truth here is we do all improvise. None of us have a script. None of us live lives where everything is determined or predictable or controlled. And so the improvisational approach in a way is to catch people succeeding, catch them doing something they can already do. And then to shine a bit more light on that by giving some names to it, by making some observations about it, and then by helping them to connect it to the things they care about.
Yeah.
So,
What I also find interesting is, I think an underestimated part of the work of a facilitator is to help the group to get out of their heads. And this is especially important for groups that are very cognitive. So highly educated people who might on the first sight maybe be attracted to this more scientific approach, then they might get stuck because they're too much in their head. And this blocks in terms of creativity, because then you have all this judgment coming in and all this expectations. Whereas when you get them into their body quickly, then it's easier to reconnect it to the mind.
I think that's absolutely right. I don't think this was something I understood at the beginning. I probably had a hunch or a feeling about it, but over time, reflecting upon it, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that our cognitive and intellectual skills are massively important, but I think we point them the wrong way. In other words, I think that the intellect and cognition are really, really important for making sense through reflection of what's already happened. I don't think they're very good or very useful at trying to create new possibility or even understanding what's going on in the present moment while we're doing it. And so I think the other intelligences, and we have language for this now, thanks to, Howard Gardner and Daniel Goleman and people like that. So this idea of multiple intelligences, that our intelligence isn't just our cognition or our intellect. And I think that puts it on a kind of a firmer footing. So by invoking and inviting those other intelligences into the room, and those intelligences are enormous and subtle and massive and fast, then we can use our intellect to its best capacity to make sense of that experience. And so the way of working that we just sketched out between us with improvisation, of a very quick or brief framing, some playful experience where people move and use their bodies, and then a debrief where you make sense of it for them, is kind of, for me, in micro, what I think we would be better suited at doing in macro. And I think this can get us into very deep waters very quickly, so tell me if it's not of interest. But it seems to me that if you go back to the Enlightenment, the project of the Enlightenment has created the modern world and all the glories and wonders that come with it, from modern medicine to technology, science, and everything that goes on with it. In fact, it's been so successful that we sometimes realize it's not the way things are. It's a particular way of looking and thinking, which has an enormous number of virtues. But in that act of forgetting, we miss that it has a shadow side. And so what we've become, in my view, is we've become too dependent upon one particular way of thinking, so that people who are in positions of authority and power will sometimes think it's strange to move or dance or sing or draw, whereas in actual fact, nothing could be further from the truth. So there's a kind of exaggerated sense of how important cognition and intellect is. And it's interesting. I was just reading some philosophy last week, a wonderful book by a guy called Brian McGee, who's a philosopher I'm very fond of, and him talking about how important it is that in all human society we use the arts, and why we would have had to invent arts and culture anyway had we not had them already, because they allow us different ways of knowing things and different ways of understanding things. So in the facilitator's world, the use of what might crudely be thought of as different media, and they are different media, using colors and shapes and music and movement and all those things, but they're not trivial. These are quite important ways of seeing, feeling, knowing, and understanding things in a different way. And then, yes, we'll need to sit down and order it and structure it with our intellects, but trying to go forward using only intellect and cognition, some people can do it, and in some contexts it's appropriate. But even in science, even in physics, we get Einstein's theory of relativity because he's sitting in a post office in Zurich, imagining riding on a beam of light. He's not working it out. It's an active imagination that he then works out into formulae and equations. So I completely agree with you. I think that whether we acknowledge it or not, we are all embodied beings. And much of what's going on between us and inside of us is not available to the intellect, or not immediately available to the intellect.
Yes, which somehow comes or relates then to the pause, because what comes to my mind is this shower moment, that our best ideas come while we're under the shower or while we are running or doing something totally irrelated, where we pause because we are not actively thinking about something. And I think these interactions with different media is a sort of pause, a creative pause from an interruption from what we usually do.
Absolutely. So pause is not nothing. A pause is not empty. A pause is, as you say, an interruption from what we normally do. It's an interruption of something and an invitation to something else. And the shower example, which is, we have a lovely saying in Spanish, which is to instead of saying to sleep on it like we do in English, we say to consult with the pillow. So there's the shower and there's sleeping on ideas, and there are different levels and kinds of mind which are working: instinct, intuition, feeling. These are all working. Well, whether they're working or not is not dependent upon you being consciously thinking about it. So when you switch off in one way, you kind of open up space for another way of thinking to happen. And this is kind of very important, because many of the issues or problems we're trying to deal with in organizations anyway, and in business, if there was a simple, straightforward, linear solution that you could reason your way to, well, we'd probably have it already. And there are problems like that, and you've probably got the solutions to those, and you've got the plans being put in place. So the ones we're left with are the ones which are more intractable, more difficult, more amorphous. You might not even know which the real issue is. And just bringing this back to design, the design for a facilitator, it lands in a very robust place, which is, so don't think that when you design in breaks, nothing's happening. One of my colleagues at Oxford thinks and talks very eloquently about you should design the spaces as well as the sessions. And so, there's a leadership program I've been part of at Oxford, which is a sort of week-long piece of facilitation, where there's a team of 6 or 7 of us that hold it all together. And, the bus rides to certain venues, the dinners, the coffee breaks, the yoga class in the morning, the Tai Chi on the lawn, the casual conversation by the coffee break, but coffee station. These we've all considered. We haven't sort of planned them microscopically, but we are aware of them and available to them, and have thought about the qualities of those spaces, And
I think especially when we meet in the physical space, to design for these serendipitous moments of the coffee machine where the magic actually happens, because two or more minds have the opportunity to exchange their perspectives on something they have experienced together.
Absolutely. And one of the ways I think about that, in Oxford, we have probably, say, 36 or 37 participants for a week, and there's 6 or 7 of us that follow the week through. There are other people come in and do presentations and deliver content, but we're there the whole time. And one of the things I kind of think about is what I call maximizing the surface area of the faculty. And so part of the design for that serendipity is that, I think the first one I've already mentioned is to first acknowledge that it's a possible space for something to happen. So to not think of it as a time, as downtime. Then the second thing is, on the part of all the faculty, what I mean by maximizing the surface area is, for me as a tutor on that program, to seek out perhaps somebody who perhaps I haven't spoken to, or perhaps I'm paying close attention and going, oh, they look a bit lost, I wonder what's going on there. Or to be a connective tissue and say, you're talking with somebody over coffee and they mention something that you've heard somebody else talk about, or that you think somebody else has a perspective to offer. And so very actively then to say, you should talk to John about that. Or Mary, why don't you tell Fred about what you were telling me there? And so all of these things, which, as I say, I'm not talking about micro planning here, but I'm talking about raising your awareness and holding the space in a way that increases the amount of contact, increases the number of possible pieces of serendipity. You can never guarantee them. You never know what they're going to be. But if you put the same thing the other way around, you know that if you don't do that and you line people up in a queue and you give them numbers, that's not going to happen, right? So yeah, you can pay attention to those things.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I believe that the participants, for them, it will pass almost unnoticed that it has been designed, and still they will realize that something is happening.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things on that particular program we've had to learn to do, which is to sort of, as it were, draw the curtain aside occasionally, because they have a sort of sublime experience of it often where they just go, oh, this is like magic, and it's amazing, and they think it just happens.
Why do we need so many people to organize that?
Well, that we get from the bean counters, but exactly. But the participants themselves think of it as something magical. Now, whilst that's very flattering, and there are elements of kind of magic to it, magical moments, of course, but it's also an inhibiting thing, because if they, we are there, this is a leadership program, and we, the faculty, are leading the program. So we are actually doing the work as we understand it. And so if they just think we're specially talented or uniquely brilliant at it, that's not helpful, because how do they learn from that? Okay. So we've had to learn to, as I say, draw the curtain aside a bit, or sometimes to unpack or unpick or point out, did you see what we did there? Normally towards the back end of the week.
Yeah.
I mean, the most extreme case I had of that came much more recently. Actually, it was the end of last year. I was doing a course on facilitation, a week-long course at Schumacher College, where I met Fritjof Capra, funnily enough, all those years ago. And my colleague, I was working with another colleague, and she had a migraine the last morning, and she had been due to run the last morning. And I got this news after the session had been meant to begin. So 27 people, they've had a wonderful week, but they're expecting it to come together in some way. And my colleague can't make it, and I now have no time. And so it was a very interesting moment. So I stood up and explained what had happened. Jenny can't make it, blah, blah, blah. And I had a decision, which was I could just carry on. I can think of something to do. I can think while I'm presenting. We've done enough. There's enough trust in the room. I can do it and not show the workings. But this is a facilitation course. And so I chose to go a step further and to say, here's what has happened. So now here's what's happening for me. So I'm standing up in front of all of you, and I don't know what we're going to do. So here's what I'm thinking. And here's where we might start. And I'm thinking out loud as I'm basically designing on my feet something for this group of people. And over the course of a few minutes, they help me simplify it. We end up with something. I send them off to do the tasks. They come back, and then there's obviously a debrief, not just of that exercise, but of the whole week at the end. And what was very interesting was that one person said he was absolutely terrified and kind of angry when I did that, because he felt that it was somehow irresponsible, that we weren't prepared. But of course, we couldn't prepare for my colleague having a migraine. That's just stuff that happens. But he went on to say, so I was a bit angry and I was frustrated on it. But then he said, but the amazing thing was, it was incredible. It did work. And so I sort of felt, vindicated by that. And I thought it was just an extreme case of showing what's actually going on, and of trusting, the group, and trusting one's knowledge and experience, and of not being frightened of saying what's actually in the room.
Thank you for sharing this example. I think that's the beauty of facilitation, and then also bringing in the improvisation. This split of a second where you are taking a decision to either go left or to go right, and then to own it.
Right.
To make your partner look good, make the participants look good, and then share it. And I think that's might have been one of the most important lessons on how to learn how to facilitate.
Yeah, I think there is a big thing here, a big piece here, which is that nothing's ever as frightening as it feels, and so the feeling that one has of fear and trepidation. And, I was, despite, 30 odd years of experience and being steeped in improvisation, that was a difficult moment, because you have to make a choice. But if you start from a place of kind of generosity, if you start from the place about, well, they have an interest in helping me solve this. And anyway, it's all of our issues. It's not my issue. That would be egotistical of me to think it was all about me.
And then it's not facilitation. That's not what the facilitation mindset is, that it would be about you.
Exactly. But what's interesting is we're such fearful and anxious creatures that those fears and anxieties can very quickly creep up on us. And so situations, like, well, what would you do if the exercise went wrong? That's an understandable fear that each of us have had, and some people have a lot. But you kind of go, well, actually, how bad could it be? What will happen if it goes wrong? First of all, let's define wrong. What happens might be different than what you expect, but what happens might be more interesting than you expect or more revealing. And actually, what you get to find out is what happens after it, quote unquote, goes wrong. But nobody dies. It's like our bodily systems are often acting as if we're under real life threat, when actually it's just an ego thing.
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of training or teaching facilitation, that every of those moments is a fantastic opportunity to reflect on a meta level on facilitations. So why did it go wrong? Was it too complex? Was it because of the instructions? Was the group too large, too small? All of these are pieces that future facilitators can learn a lot from by experiencing it.
Absolutely. These days, I don't really think about things going wrong at all. So there's another colleague who works with improvisation where he says we have different perspectives on this. He talks about don't be frightened of failure. And I say, what's failure? Because what you define as a failure, I would say anything and everything is something you can take and use. So many of the most fruitful learning experiences for me and for the group I was facilitating have occurred when you could say something failed. And I say you could say something failed because, let's say, the group didn't understand the instructions, but that created a whole series of responses that were much more interesting and rich than had everything gone swimmingly. So I think that's right. And I think one of the things that keeps me interested in facilitating is that it is a wonderful education for oneself, because you're constantly having to check in and see, have I fallen into thinking it's about me, or am I concerned? I mean, that story I told about the very first time I realized this was what I was doing, the sleepless night I had, it was the summer, so there wasn't much dark. And I was out at 4:00 in the morning, walking around the gardens of this big posh hotel. And I realized that what was getting in the way of the group was me worrying about how I was looking. And there was, in my kind of anxiety and fatigue, there was a thing I just noticed. I was thinking about, well, what will they think of me? But this is my agenda. But I thought, and it was me. And I went, whoa. That comes later. And of course, just as you said, the way in an improv discipline, I hadn't done any improv at this point, but the thing is, if you look after your colleagues, they'll look after you, right? So and that's exactly what happened for me on that day, which was by looking after what the group needed, I got that somewhat humorous comment from the client at the end, which was coming from him, very high praise indeed, So yeah, this kind of the opportunity and the joy of the work it's all stuff to learn from.
Yeah. So what would you consider as a failed workshop?
Yeah, that's a good counter question. Frankly, I would consider a failed workshop one where exactly what you expected to happen happens. And so for some people,
it's opportunity for learning, basically.
Yeah. So now sometimes that might be appropriate, but that's essentially a political process. So we're having a gathering of people. We know the result we want to get. We've got to get these people to agree with us, and everything goes exactly as you want, and you get them out. And you kind of go, well, okay, you might need to do that occasionally, but that's not, for me, a facilitation process. That's a political process. And, of kind of convincing and sort of everybody having agendas and you coming out with yours intact.
It sounds like a theater play as opposed to an improv play.
Yeah.
Where the political process is a theater play, a scripted play, and a workshop is an improv play.
I mean, there's other ways that they can fail, that workshop could fail temporarily, I suppose, so there's one workshop I was doing where the fire alarm went off at the venue we were at, and we were all outside. It was November. It was freezing cold, and we had to stay outside for hours in the freezing cold because nobody was sure if this was a test or a false alarm. And that, in a way, was kind of a failure because the workshop kind of stopped, and it was grim and it was cold. But there was another occasion at Oxford where actually there was a fairly miserable terrorist attack. Somebody planted an incendiary bomb in the venue that we were working at. And we managed to move the whole program to a hotel nearby in the course of about 12 hours. And it was done so elegantly that the participants all thought it was part of the plan. Which takes us back to your point about when you do things really elegantly. And I think this is another thing for facilitators to consider, is oftentimes the most extraordinary, exquisite, beautiful work that you do will not be noticed or acknowledged because people think either it was just going to happen, or they thought it was part of the plan, or they thought it was about their own brilliance. And that just comes with the territory, right? Partly a good test of a facilitator is to make it look effortless.
Yeah. Which then requires the inner work and forgetting about the ego.
And also a trust and faith that the deep inner work, for anybody that is alive to it or awake to it, which is probably more people than you might imagine, does get noticed. But it doesn't get noticed, doesn't get necessarily put down on the feedback forms. It doesn't necessarily get into the evaluations. There's a deeper appreciation that happens there. So in the end, it does pay off. But what you can't be doing is making your choices in order to gain approval. Mm. You have to, and I think you're absolutely right to shine a light on the inner work. I don't see how you can do truly valuable work as a facilitator without some inner work.
Yeah.
I just don't see that that's possible because it's a human thing,
And there are too many potential triggers involved and human dynamics that if you're not standing there, having dealt with your inner shit.
Well, the other thing is, I remember there's a particular room that I used a lot in Oxford over many, many years. And, my natural style of working had always been kind of collaborative and kind of getting along with people, if you like. And in this context at, the business school at Oxford University with illustrious people in the group and in the, in the wings and kind of, famous speakers coming in and everything, I realized that the style I naturally adopted had limitations and that the group needed me on occasion to not just be in the center of the room, but to really hold it and use the power that it gave. And that came with some authority. And I don't naturally like being kind of authoritative about things. It isn't the kind of way I'd learned to work up until then. But what was really helpful to me is to understand that this was a requirement of the whole setting. So there are times when you, if you like, you have to have done the inner work to see that the situation calls upon me to exercise a muscle or a style that is not my favorite, but it needs done. And so sometimes that for me would be saying to people, no, stop that. Mm. We don't have time for that. That's a very interesting question. Come and talk to me afterwards. And to close people down and shut them off. Or to speak with authority about a subject where, I might feel like there were colleagues in the room who knew more, but they weren't in the center of the room at that point. And I needed to be able to speak with that voice and, do that kind of stuff. So that inner work, there's lots of different ways you have to transcend yourself when you're going to do this work.
And it just caught my curiosity to hear this no from someone who is an improviser.
Yeah.
Feels like a challenge or sounds like a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, this is a beautiful one. When I was a novice at this, I used to struggle with this, but it's actually super sweet because one of the myths around improvisation is that improvisation is all about saying yes. That's not even true on the improv stage. It's actually not physically possible because actually by saying yes to something, you're saying no to something else. So the two are much more interestingly related. But the thing here is, and the reason I love this as a topic now is to say that yes and no each have merit and worth. And even within the improvisational discipline, that is true. But you need to know what the merit and worth of each is and what the shortcomings of each are. So if you're at the generative point where you need a flow of ideas and you need a flow of energy, then no comes at a high cost. But if you're trying to reach a conclusion or make a connection or give something meaning where there are too many things, too many ideas swirling around, then you say yes at your peril, because you just create more and more confusion and complexity. So as a story evolves, if you just take story as an analogy for whatever you're interested in, but improvisers make stories, at the beginning of a story, you have to say yes a lot. And towards the end of a story, you have to say no a lot more. Because otherwise the story just gets balloons out of shape.
And how do you say no in a very practical sense and still make your partner look good?
Well, this takes us back to the multiple intelligences, if you like, because the word no there's many different ways you can render the word no. I can say no, 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 no. So mood, tone, setting, gesture, posture, position, all of these things, all of the physical cues, if I stand behind, if you and I are working together and you're suggesting something that I want to say no to, I might make a joke out of it by standing behind you and kind of miming to the group, no, I might do that. Or I might say, no, Miriam, I think if you check the time, I think we probably need to move on now. Let's not do that. And so there's a million ways of saying no. And once you get used to it and stop this kind of fantasy that you can say yes to everything and yes is good and no is bad, then you'll see how appreciative a group is. Yeah.
And
but it's a craft. It's a craft. You have to learn that skill. It's not simple. Not simple at all.
Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.